Teach us to seek you in all that has life, that we may see you as the light of life. Teach us to search for you in our own depths, that we may find you in every living thing. So last week we talked about looking suffering straight in the face. And I thought it would be good for us to remember some of the things that we said about understanding that life is shrouded in pain. So we said that pain is the admission to life. Pain gives energy to listen to others' pain, whether it's close or global. Buddhism talks about life is suffering. The tendency we have sometimes is to become attached to the temporary. In a different way, pain is admission to love. Someone talked about finding joy if we listen to others' pain. And that stepping into pain brings release. I'd like for us to begin by listening to Oh the Deep, which is sung by Daryl, not sung, it's played by Daryl Braun. And I'm going to show you some of the words that are part of this hymn tune that we know. I'd like you to meet a couple of people that are referenced in this chapter. John Scotus, Irigina. He spoke about the fact that Christ wears two shoes in the world, scripture and nature. Both are necessary to understand the Lord, and at no stage can creation be seen as a separation of things from God. He lived in the 9th century.
Mm.
And then another is Paul Tillich. Interesting thing about Paul Tillich is he's buried at New Harmony. He met Jane Owen, who was the one who kind of reestablished New Harmony after she married her husband, Mr. Owen. And she was an heiress of oil from Texas and moved up to New Harmony, and then kind of reestablished New Harmony, not as a community that was attempted for two times, but was to create a way to engage what the intent of New Harmony was. And she and Paul Tillich became friends, and he's buried. And this is at New Harmony. I suspect that that's, right now I can't think of the river. It may pop in my head, but it's a river that moves down to the Ohio River, right around Evansville, Indiana. But he's known for this quote: "One cannot be strong," he said, "without love. For love is not an irrelevant emotion. It is the blood of life." So we begin today looking at the concept of digging God out. And Eddie Hillesum, who we talked about last week and earlier also, she's kind of one of the primary sources for this book. As a reminder, she is a young Jewish woman who cared for people who were brought to Westport in the Netherlands during the war. And when people were housed there before they were, the word was she used was shipped off to Poland.
How did you do it?
In their lives. And she said this, though: "I love people so terribly because in every human I love something of you, O God. And I seek you everywhere in them and often find something of you." She goes on to say that there is a well deep inside of every human being in which God dwells. But so often the inner well is blocked with stones and grit, and God is buried. So she uses the language, God must be dug out again. So how do we dig God out? Suggestion that Paul Tillich gives is we can seek the holy not by turning away from life. Maybe I could ask if you have if you could mute your Zoom system, that would be great. That will help with the feedback. Thank you. So Paul Tillich said, we will seek the holy not by turning away from life, but by penetrating the very heart of life.
Thank you.
So digging God out. Perhaps this is, you've not thought about before. This statement invites us to connect with the immanence of God. Paul Tillich spoke of the transcendent one as the immanent one. He says, we will find the heights of the mystery by delving into the depths of the universe and the human soul. So the question that I have that we can begin with today is wondering about that concept. I'm wondering if we've thought of God more as transcendent than as immanent. So I'd like to have you think with me about that for a bit. And if you have responses, I invite you to talk about that. What do you notice in yourself as you engage that thought? I've listed something that I engage in every day, so we can talk about that, but I'm interested in what you're thinking in relationship to that.
You know, one of the things I think, Bill, is just, first of all, being willing to take the time to do this. I would say that's one of the biggest burdens that a lot of people face is not taking the time. We're so busy that we're always distracted. Until you take the time, you can't really do the job.
Mm-hmm. So you'd say our culture is distracted? Other thoughts?
Yeah, I often feel that if we think of God as transcendent, God becomes an abstract concept. And you start wondering about the nature of the world, the problem of evil, and all these things that seem to go beyond the ability to really experience life and to experience the goodness that there can be in life, beauty and love, friendship, those kinds of things are, I sense, more within what we encounter on a daily basis. And we need to be reminded that we have to find God in what we see and the people we meet every day.
A practice that I use would be the breath prayer, which is a way that brings God more eminent into my life, focuses me on God in my life in the moment. And I would say that's the other part of it. It helps me to live in the moment in God's presence.
So if I were to invite you to wonder about that, do you have a sense that your life with God is more immanent than transcendent? Or is it too hard to talk about that?
It's a mystery, Bill. That's how I see it. It's living in part of God, the mystery of God.
Any
So,
other input that any of you have?
I've been helping at the vaccine clinic for the COVID vaccine.
Yeah, this mine is muted.
And what I have experienced is just the joy of the people actually being there, getting the vaccine, and feeling like this is a movement away from being so isolated during these times to approach being able to touch other human beings and hug each other and share with them.
I find in my life that I begin each day living in the moment and listening for God. And that it's a mystery to me, but it always comes from nature sounds and from fresh air, and just, I guess that creates an imminent moment with God for me. And then there are times when the transcendent pushes itself into my inner vision. And it is in a very abstract kind of way, which is very difficult to explain, but I recognize that it's a little bit further out from my being, if that makes any sense.
Anything else that you'd like to share, anyone? Well, I think one of the things that we discover is it's not easy to talk about that. So we tend to push maybe abstract things away from us, where on the other hand, we like the physical connection. And maybe I was speaking more out of my own context, where I was thinking that maybe we grew up with a more transcendent sense of God, in that it's not easy to talk about this mystery. And I think that part of this, the concept of digging God out, is to be able to look deeply into the experiences that we have within ourselves and the experiences that others have within themselves, that can be engaged. It's like going into a cave and finding a place where you need to dig your way through it to get to where you want to go. The invitation is to hold these two together. I think that that's maybe what's important. It's not one or the other, it's both and. Newell talks about that everything is begotten of God. And he goes to the, to the creation story, to Genesis, saying, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. This is not only that we say is life-giving, but also that which speaks of death. So it doesn't exclude. I think that sometimes we feel that that our experience in this world wants to focus on one thing. And, Pastor Ben talked about it today in his sermon in terms of death that happens, and that God keeps reminding us of that. We'll get to that in just a bit, but everything as being begotten of God includes both life and death. Now, this picture that you have here is the Pietà, which is in New Harmony. And if you look closely at the picture, you can see the head of the crucified Christ coming out of the breast of Mary. Mary's breast is split open, and it's hard to look at. And so she says, part of digging God out is to release the woundedness of God that is present in our pain. So the question that I have of us is that something that's a challenge for us because we resist in being open to talking about that. This is the entry to the Ruthless church in New Harmony. And it is, I show it to you just so that you get a perspective of what you see. Now, what you don't see is kind of the comparison between where the Pietà is and what I'm going to show you next, which is the Polish memorial. If you were to go into this gateway, through the gateway here, and turn right, you would go to the Pietà. And if you would go to the left, you would see the Polish memorial. And so the book invites us to balance the Pietà with the Polish memorial. John Philip Newell talks about the experience that he had in 2010 when he preached at the 50th anniversary of the Ruthless Church. And he lifted up the Pietà as an invitation to look at the pain that we experience in life. And he talks a lot about that in this book. He talks about it particularly in relationship to his family, his great-grandfather, his grandfather, his son, which at that time was when his son began to be challenged with bipolar disease. But what he didn't talk about was the balance with the Polish memorial, which was in the Ruthless Church, which shows a picture, which you see here, of the image of God, an interesting image of God, a very kingly presence. But what's unique about it is that this image of God is holding up the crucified one. So the invitation in terms of digging God out is we need to name our pain, for when we name it, we are held by a loving God, as shown in this Polish memorial. This is Jane Owen. You've seen her picture before, but she was the kind of person who talked about joining opposites, because she felt very strongly that if you joined opposites rather than not joining them, you ended up with a way to live in life. In a similar way, Julian of Norwich speaks about a countenance partly of joy and partly of sorrow. And this was Jane Owen. She had the gift of holding both. And I think that's the invitation that we have in this chapter, is to grow in knowing how to hold both pain and sorrow. Opening ourselves to share a pain when appropriate, and being open to another's desire to listen deeply and hold that pain. Much like the words from Deuteronomy, underneath are the arms of an everlasting God. Jane had learned that and showed others how to. In fact, John Philip Newell would say, that's what she taught me. So I'm wondering how you experience that, if that's something you would like to talk about. When you faced your own pain, was there a strength that was born?
This isn't a personal story, but I don't know if many of you have seen the Pixar film Inside Out. It's a film specifically for children, but with profound truth for adults about our emotions. And at the beginning of the movie, it seems like joy is bad and sorrow, or joy is good and sorrow is bad. But the point of the movie is that to truly live life well, we need to be able to have our joy and our sorrow become friends.
So is that something that is helpful for us, to look at joy and sorrow as friends of one another?
I think it truly is, because when you think of joy, you think of the sweetness of life. And when you feel sorrow, that's the bitter taste. So it's almost as if one must blend both together to build upon a strength within yourself.
When I am sad that I haven't seen someone in a long time, it reminds me that's because I love that person and I have joy in their presence. And so often my sadness helps remind me what it is that brings me joy.
Yeah, Carolyn shared that with me. She's in the other room. There's a story that I'd like to share with you. And if we could, it maybe enliven us to our own memories of pain that we've experienced and where strength came out of that. My mom died back in 2013, and I became the person who was primarily responsible for putting everything together, which, you know, it creates, or it really visualizes for me what happens to me when I face loss, which is painful. I get busy, and there's avoidance. My older sister was the first family member to come to Chico. And as she sat with me, she says, "You're not crying because mom died." And I said, you know, that's part of my story. I'm hoping that I'll get closer to understanding what that's about in my life. I have a few years left, but anyway, and she got really angry at me for not crying. And I tried to sit with that and hold it in a way that wouldn't, you know, reject her words. And so I did share with her. I said, you know, Betty, I said, I've created some places in the worship service where I know I'm just going to lose it. And she says, well, what's that? And I says, well, we're going to be singing. And every time I sing, I a lot of times lose my composure and I'm just voiceless. And tears stream down my face. And then I said, we're also going to be playing some brass ensemble work. And I think the same is going to happen there too. I said, so I'm going to cross that bridge to what your expectations are for me. And, you know, I guess what I can say to you about that, about myself, is that I continue. It's not like I don't face the pain and the loss, but I have noticed how I can help myself there to move to receiving strength. So it's more than just some conceptual thought, but it's rather an experience that I have. So I thought I'd share that with you. And maybe that might trigger something for you as you think about where strength comes when you face pain.
Bill,
Go ahead.
the two things I'd like to share is I think back to the time that both my mother and Faye fought cancer. And it took my mother 7 years to die from it, and Faye has survived it. But to be helpful and, the two-way strength there and how you can help the other person and when they're battling these things and undergoing some of the treatments that they have to undergo, and those treatments, some of them are pretty vicious. And you have to kind of be there as as a strength, and also they help you with building your strength. Yeah, you get, have I kind of expressed what I'm trying to say clear enough?
Yeah, I think that it's what you're talking about is mutuality. That when we are with another, and sometimes we feel as though we might be better off, and yet because we don't have that experience, but you know your own pain and the struggles that you've had in your life, Carl. And yet we do play that role to hear the pain and support in our listening and giving thanks for either for your mother coming to a time when she was able to let go and to live forever with God, or for Faye to have the medications that assisted her in continuing to give her life.
And in some respects, I see the roles of pastors sometimes being supporting and also building your faith when you're concerned about those as closest to you having a problem. Sometimes just either words of comfort they can share, or a prayer, or working together to give additional strength.
I think the gift that comes, the strength that comes when we face pain, is to discover that that we can make it through, that it's not something to be feared, but rather it is something that we can face.
Carl's comments make me think that and reflect that often when I have had really challenging moments in my life, I have found strength to get through those, but I have found the strength is not within me. I discovered the strength is outside of me, in my friends and in my family, and of course in God, that it's their strength that carries me through, not my own.
I would like to add to that the idea of people who suffer from despair and take their own lives. It seems like that is because they are not feeling, they're not reaching out, they do not feel surrounded by love from outside. They feel alone against the harshness of the universe, as they don't feel love coming into them. And having had a first cousin who killed himself at 21, realizing that if he'd been around people, that wouldn't have happened.
Bill, I remember I think it was last year, you taught a course using the book Vesper Time.
Yes.
And I found that actually to be a really, really helpful book, partly because it made clear that there are seasons of life that we all go through. There are progressions of life. Our situations change. The challenges that we face change. The way we may understand God or understand what friendship is, or even what marriage is, or what a pastor's role is, will change with time. But that it's also, it's not just that challenges are changing, it's that different ways of thinking about yourself and about God and about relationships come as your life moves through these stages. And I've kind of found that really helpful to think about, that I think about these issues of how you face yourself, how you face pain, how you face the nature of God. It just differs as your own circumstances change. You're not as strong as you used to be. You have faculties that are failing at a certain point. You have members of your family that are no longer present. And it's in those different kinds of moments, in those different worlds that you live in, you have to reinvent these relationships almost every day.
It was interesting to me, Joel, as you were talking, I thought about, for some people, as they get older, it happens to younger people too, but they are not able to hear as well. That really gives an opportunity to listen more deeply, even though maybe you can't hear what is being spoken, but you can. I mean, some people learn to read lips. But I think that there are certainly some images that come to us when we think about getting older and losing some of the resources that we become so familiar with.
And for some people that are in my age group and are my friends, I'm finding that the offer of well, let's go on a hike. Well, there's a lot of folks that say, I just can't do that anymore. Right? Or individuals who I had a student who struggled with hearing many, many years ago, but finally decided that he'd had it with the fight and he was just going to enter the deaf world. He was just going to stop using hearing aids, and he was going to but he was going to live with individuals who also suffered from the same debility, struggles that he did. Sight is another one, that I'm beginning to, encounter folks in my circle who are struggling with the ability to see, macular degeneration and these kinds of things. And so maybe, it's God is present for them in different ways then, but, maybe instead of thinking about, well, how they're going to deal with their God issues, maybe it's worth asking, how do I begin to think about new ways of interacting with people who can't go on hikes or who can't see or whatever? It's not just a passive thing of waiting for God to respond, but thinking about how you accompany people. You know, this language of accompaniment that you got in Vesper time was quite helpful.
Yeah. And I would invite, you know, us to really think deeply about how it is that you become the manifestation, the immanence of God in those moments of time when you shift your view to pay attention to what the other person who has diminishments. How do you sit with that and hold that and value that? I think that that's really a place where there it can be strength in one's living. Well, I'd like to move along. We don't have a lot of time left. A couple of things I want you to notice. This is just the reality that we've been talking about. Is the invitation is to co-join things, you know, rather than to polarize and separate. And so these are some images for us to think about. We've been talking a little bit about our personal suffering. And this is just suffering that happens outside of us, except for maybe the last one where we can talk about how many people have died from COVID. And this morning I was reading in the New York Times about some women in an area between Syria and Iraq. And these women were enslaved by ISIS. And many of them became property. And they were raped and they bore children. And the story about them today was, you know, they gave birth to children and then they were forced to leave their children behind because of the nature of how they were conceived. And yet they still wanted to reconnect with their children and the challenge that they had in that. You know, on the one hand, you have people who were abusing them. And on the other hand, their local community where they were living now, who said they could not come back with these children into their community. But, you know, I read that and I just was, I was so angry that these women were raped. And I was so angry at the family system where they were living, where they were not able to come back with their children. And now they're looking for another home for these women. It's a large group of women, but the women who wanted to welcome these children that they birthed into their lives. They were bone of their bone. John Philip Newell moves from talking about pain and suffering to hubris, which I thought was interesting. I think that it could be that part of our resistance to talking about our pain is that maybe we might think that we become filled with hubris in terms of sharing it. That somehow in naming my pain, it can lift myself up above others and demean others. So there is a caution that he talks about here. Hildegard of Bingen talks about arrogance is always evil because it oppresses, disperses, and deprives everything. Irigina, who we talked about earlier, talks about falseness as that which seeks to be what it is not. And so Newell talks about that we live with the delusion that we think we can pollute the earth and not pollute our souls. So there's a wide range of thinking about hubris in our lives. And so that might be a restraining factor, but he really is trying to get at this concept that we know so well as Lutherans. He uses both sin and then the meaning of the word to sunder. And the devil's nature is binary. It's one or the other. Sin in its definition means to tear apart. We tear apart what belongs together. The life of humanity and the life of the whole creation. Teilhard de Chardin says it's counter-evolution. And he would say that. If we forget our interdependence with the earth, it will lead to depletion. So this covers a wide range from personal pain to the creation's pain. And Newell comes to the end of this chapter with the invitation. And in some ways, we were talking about that on the front end. The law of the universe is love. That to the extent that we disregard it, we imperil our very existence. Meister Eckhart, from a while ago, has this quote: "As long as you love one single person less than you love yourself, you have never really loved yourself." I'm interested in us talking about that. How do we take that in?
Feels like an impossible task to me.
Boy, that's exactly what I was thinking. Seems like to keep alive requires a certain amount of effort. If you don't love yourself enough to keep yourself alive, then you can't keep going. And how could we make that effort for everyone else? So I don't understand the concept.
I guess to be fair, Dad, there was one person who did love everyone else more than himself. And yes, he died.
Okay, right. But generally, he's considered to be superhuman.
So perhaps this is one of the challenges that Newell has in addressing well, this really wasn't Newell's issue. This was This is Meister Eckhart. Is it the invitation perhaps to recognize that we can't, as Ben shared? You know, that it's not something that is a possibility.
You know, Bill, it seems that it's when I think of that statement, I mean, I agree with your analysis. It's almost it seems impossible to do it. But you know, when I think about it, it's about ego, right? It's about self-absorption. It's about self-reference. When the whole world revolves around you, and other people can't be seen for what they are in the image of God and worthy of your love as well as God's, then that's where you're going to fail in living out the life that God and Christ would want you to. And you know, a good Lutheran would say, well, that's why we thank heavens we have redemption, because Meister Eckhart's view as a Catholic and a mystic is it's the impossible possibility, I think he would say. It's like self-sacrificial love, right? You can, it's the goal that you always seek out, but it's something that you perhaps in the real world can't ever grasp. And so you need redemption. But you've got to come to terms with your ego and the way in which it stands in the way of what God would want for you.
Yet it does feel like it drives us to the cross, either in, as my father said, to love others at least as much as you love yourself will require you to lay down your life for them. And if we find ourselves unable to do that, then we need someone else on the cross instead of us. Praise be to God, we have that in Jesus.
And yet I think of the people who in their lives gave themselves up that others might live. In a sense that could be a metaphor that it doesn't replace Christ, but it could be an icon that would point to Christ.
Bill, I've noticed that I'm thinking about a quote from Mother Teresa, that if we judge someone, we fail to love them, or it prevents us from loving them. And I've noticed that when I'm judging someone else and shutting off my love for them, it's more often than not, it's something within myself that I'm seeing in them rather than seeing it in myself. And I'm noticing my own failure or my own weakness in that other person. And so a fuller, more holistic approach is to repent of that and realize that, yeah, if I want to truly love myself, I do need to love that other person, even with our faults.
And going along with what Annalisa said, when you first started talking about that, that was one of the first things that came to mind. And I wondered, you know, to look around in my own life, who is it? Who are the people or the persons that I don't love the way I love myself? And what is that all about? You know, what, like Annalisa was talking about, what is it I'm noticing in them that perhaps reflects on something that I have a problem facing in myself?
Mm-hmm. Well, we are coming past time, so I'd like to end up our time together. I'm not sure what my last slide is here. This is the invitation, what will enable us to name our brokenness and live in that place of repose of which Eddie Hillison speaks. And I think Jane Owen's words are good words for us to remember. Opening ourselves to share our pain when appropriate, and being open to another's desire to listen deeply and to hold that pain. So as we experience both personal and global places of pain in life, this is perhaps an operating way for us to move forward. I'd like to close with a prayer. I don't know if anyone has anything else they'd like to share before we close.
I've got a quick one for you, Bill. And that I'm having trouble with that previous concept, the wordingology, I guess. The one thing that somebody touched on that kind of rung a bell with me was there are some people that are in the armed forces that are in the infantry or in that kind of a zone that will lay down their lives for the people, their brothers that they have fought with. And I once this week, past 2 weeks, saw a little article about a sister saying about her brother always leading patrols. And he says, I am at peace with myself and I know where I'm going. And it gives these other fellows a chance to get in touch with God. So unselfishness in that kind of a situation. Period.
Thank you, Carl. Just invite us into a moment of silence before we close with prayer. Before us in the planned shape of this day, we look for surgings of new life. Around us and the people we know and love, we look for gifts of unopened promise. Within us, in the familiar sanctuary of our own soul, we look for shining of the everlasting light. Behind us, around us, within us, we look for your life-giving mystery, O God. Before us, around us, and within us. Well, thank you for coming today.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Bill.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you, Bill.
Yep.
Have a great day.
Same to all of you.